The one thing that I notice more and more is that we talk all about the data and the inaccuracies of things about AI. We don't talk about the inaccuracy of humans. And so I think it's less about measuring AI and other technologies like this against the perfection and expecting perfection,
Right.
but measuring against how is it doing compared to what a human is doing.
I'm Derek Aranda, and this is Supply Change. Here, we go beyond AI hype to examine how to stand up intelligent supply chains in complex organizations. If you want a clear-eyed view of how to do this in the real world, this show is for you. Welcome to today's episode of Supply Change. I am thrilled to be joined by Brian Reed, and I could tell you a lot about Brian. Got a chance to work with him on a really big project and have really come to appreciate and really admire his breadth of knowledge and expertise. So really excited to have him on today's conversation, and I think hopefully we get him back again at some point in the future. Rather than me introducing you, Brian, perhaps if you could say a little bit about your illustrious career.
Sure. Thanks, Derek. Great to see you, and hopefully we can continue this going, as you said, and keep it going into the future. My name is Brian Reed. I am an executive sponsor here at Oracle, which is an odd title for a name in a technology company. But in short, what it means is that I represent our entire development organization with our customers and ensuring they get to go live, as we call it, with their new systems and their new capabilities and drive the value that they need, hopefully on time or as close to it, and do that in an efficient nature. And of course, do that at the most cost efficiency that we can get with them. And so, I'm kind of lucky in the fact that my goals are pretty easily. Did the customer go live and are they happy? At the same time, that can be a bit fuzzy. So it brings some challenges that we have to go through day to day.
Fantastic. No, thank you for that. And certainly one of the things that I also appreciate is that you've done that at Oracle, but you've also done that at other organizations, right? So you've seen it both from the provider perspective as well as really as a consumer, right? So as an operator, bringing these things to life. So you've gotten that sort of end-to-end perspective that we can certainly lean into.
Yeah, I've had people, especially recently, it seems in the past few years, ask me like, how did you design the career like this? And I wish I could take credit. Like, I wish I could say, oh, this was my grand plan. I
Right.
knew it was going to work out like this. But to your point, I've been a bit lucky. I started outside of supply chain completely. My degrees are in chemistry and genetics, so nothing to do with
Right.
supply chain. But I have it in my blood. And my dad worked in supply chain ever since I can remember, going to warehouses when I was 4 or 5 years old and as a little kid. So it's been kind of in my blood and in the conversation at the table for dinner and the family. But I've had the luxury of starting in the technology side and supply chain. Then I had the ability to go into consulting, where I did a little bit of business and a little bit of technology, and that's really where I expanded my global reach. And now I think I'm up to 56 countries, on the ground, experiencing how supply chains work around the world. Took it from there and spent some time a little bit off the road, as we say, and worked in an operation or a manufacturing organization and ran a big part of their supply chain and helped them grow from a decent sized company to an even bigger one that just continues to amaze us and how large that they grow. And then from there, I had the opportunity. I think where we connected the most was spending some time in a logistics provider. So seeing that third party perspective, which I'd worked a lot with in my consulting days and some of the technology, but it's always different
Yeah.
when you're in the organization and you're really pinching the pennies, especially as they say in places like retail and logistics, those fine margins that you're working off of.
Yeah.
And then from there, I even had the experience from the Amazon perspective from AWS, and AWS had a unique role in that I was technology focused, but everyone wanted to know what Amazon was doing. So part of my job being pan Amazon was to be able to educate our customers on what does Amazon do and how do they do it without
Yeah.
giving away all the secrets, and making sure that they can apply those things to how they do it. And again, doing that around the world. And gosh, I've lost track of how many different industries I've helped, kind of guide down these pathways with, which for me is exciting. I
Yeah.
love learning. I'm learning today. I learned yesterday, and I'm going to learn tomorrow.
Right.
So I think having that exposure to all those different areas, all these different kind of companies, it excites me. Right, keeps me going, keeps me coming to work every day. So it's a lot of fun.
Actually, I didn't realize until today we had that connection on you did genetics. My undergrad was in biology, right? And so, coming into supply chain, I actually love the connection between that systems thinking mindset that you bring from biology and genetics into supply chain, right? I mean, it is not you don't flip one switch and then you get an answer. It's really how you're dialing in a whole bunch of switches, right? That you hope give you what you want at the end of the day. So there you go. I learned something there just right there in terms of that connection.
Yeah, supply chains are organisms,
No,
right? Just like
exactly.
you said, and they're as complex, they're as fascinating, and they're as much a pain as organisms can be. So
Right. No, exactly. It's funny because if I take that analogy, right? One of the things that we talked about in one of the earlier episodes is really that journey to autonomy, right? And that is not something that you just start at the top of the pyramid. You're starting. There's a progression you have to go through, and whether that's from automation to analytics to cognition, and then ultimately to autonomy. And really, one of the threads that runs through that is data, right? And the importance and criticality of having data. I mean, it's become a truism, garbage in, garbage out. We hear that over and over again to the point where it's probably lost really a lot of the meaning that it should have. But I think just like in genetics, right, you start from the gene to the organelle to the cell. I can geek out on this, right? To the organ systems and all the way up to ecosystems. It's how do you have those building blocks that progressively end up in terms of the decision making that we as human beings make. And really, you talk about genes, that's information, right? And that's how do you encode data and transmit data with across biological systems. So again, I can geek out in that space. But certainly, as we look at that pyramid with data really being a common thread through that, we've certainly had that experience in supply chains where, is the data credible, right? Can I trust it? Is the data actionable, right? Is the data reliable? Think about, do we understand what that data means, right? How is that data being transmitted? There are lots of different dimensions that people need to think about when they think about data, not just simplistically garbage in, garbage out. I mean, when we were working together, classic examples of, how do I define, on time and in full? Versus how does customer one define on time in full, or customer two, or customer three? And do I have the data to be able to calculate it three different ways to harmonize and actually make sense of what those different ways of calculating, on time in full mean? I remember when we've talked about sort of cleansing data, in one system, it's the plant name. In another system, it's the city that the plant is in. In another system, it's the SAP code for that plant. And there's some poor soul that has to take those three reports and then say, well, here it says, plant. In this report, that matches city. And in this report, that matches plant code. So now that's how that data flows. So, those are just some simple examples of where people need to think about data just in terms of, well, what does it mean? But maybe love to, lean into a bit of your experience in terms of data. What do people tend to miss when they think about data being foundational, being important on a digital, autonomous AI journey?
I think you're right. I think we take data for granted in a
Mm,
lot of cases, especially nowadays with so much of it, right? I mean,
right,
you could argue 10, 20, 30 years ago, the volume of data, especially the amount that we had digitized in the digital format was smaller. But I think we take for granted what we have, and then we assume, to your point, that it's all equal, and it's not.
right,
Some of it is more valuable than others. Some of it is a derivation of other data. So to your
hmm,
point, maybe we call it one thing, someone else calls it different, but maybe you're trying to get a third answer off of
right,
something in the middle, and you don't necessarily have the root data or the foundational data. So I think that can be a problem that really causes a lot of challenges for people, is understanding where the data is coming from, how they're
right,
acquiring that data. I think now especially, and I'm not sure if it's driven by AI or if it's just that point at where we are in the evolution, but people are paying more attention to the acquisition of the data.
right,
Before, I think the data was just, it was flowing because people were doing things, they were recording things, and then we decided to digitize those, or we decided to go straight to digital for those. But I think people are being a bit more deliberate on
right.
what they're gathering, how they're gathering. And back to what you pointed out is how we're storing the data in the first place.
Yeah,
Structures associated with that, locations. So the more places you store data, the more challenges you have. I mean, unfortunately, I don't know if this is good or bad, but going back to your organism idea, I mean, when you're talking about genes and DNA and everything else, there's errors in
yeah,
DNA all the time.
right,
Some of those are exhibited, but many of them aren't because there's corrective actions. So you start with the known way of recording things, and that's a standard. But then on top of that, you can't just assume the standard's always going to work. You
right,
also have to make sure you factor in corrective actions along the way. Sometimes we call those resiliency, different terms that we might use on that. But I think having this foundation of data, there's the two sides of making sure that you're recording it correctly in the first place, making sure that's clean. I hate to use that word
Mm,
clean because
mm,
nothing's ever perfectly clean. And
right.
then how do we use data that we have that we didn't control when it got in there?
Yeah.
And that's the heavier lift, right? Is data that's just there. We found it. We created it at some point. Now, how do we make the
Right.
most out of it?
Right.
How do we trust it? I worked in the this side of the world when we were talking a lot about how do we trust data, how we trust each other with data from a partner
Right.
perspective. And so it got a lot into different algorithms and different technologies associated with that, and even those have their limitations. So yeah, it's a very complex and kind of multi-threaded area.
Right. No, and I think what you're getting at, right, is simplistically a lot of people think about it's either the volume of data or it's the numbers themselves, right? In terms of, it do I have a one or a two or a three? But in many ways, that's the easy part, right? Well, easy in the sense that yes, there is a ton of data. There's not an organization out there that frankly is this might be, it's not necessarily lacking data, right?
Hmm.
The data is there, but it's really how are you organizing that data? And that's everything from, how are you stacking, input A goes with decision B that leads to outcome C, as much as, how am I drawing the relationships with my data? How am I, to your point, how am I acquiring that data? How am I passing it on? How am I processing that data? And I think that's where a lot of organizations don't appreciate the management of data. In one of the roles I did before, it was coming to the realization of, it's not just having the analyst, it's having the architect, it's having, the data lake, and how is the data lake structured. It's thinking about, what are the inputs, what are the outputs. It's thinking about, well, how are those systems connected. It's things as simple as, I have data on lead times, right? I have data coming from my supplier in terms of when is a product going to arrive, but maybe my system doesn't process that data for it only processes it twice a day, right? And guess what's happening in the meantime? In the meantime, it's not I don't have the data, but in the meantime, I have 5 people calling them saying, "Well, where's my load? Where's my load?" Right? So it's
Yeah.
how are you organizing around that data? Is what are you seeing in terms of how people are starting to think more structurally about managing the way data is managed?
I think it's a great point because we hear a lot, and especially now, and you see it on the LinkedIn and the other platforms, right, where people are talking about, "Hey, I ran an AI program and it was a complete failure because I found out my
Right.
data was awful." That's not a failure to me. Like,
Right.
you didn't know your data was awful before you ran the program. Now you know your
Right.
data is awful, so it has some value, right?
That's
It didn't
right.
necessarily fix your data, which is, of course, what everybody wants, but it identified the issue and hopefully gave you some, point in places to go look and to, fix, to update, to ingest. I think you also made another great point, which is the speed of data is
Mm,
important. So you can have a lot of data, but the age of that data,
right.
and I deal with this daily, right? We're working with customers and they have challenges either on their own or with the products, and we're trying to, get to these go lives. And I've got some coming here really soon that are going to be some of the largest in our organization's history. And they change hourly or even sometimes
Right.
faster. And the action that you're going to take from the data, just like I do, is going to be dependent on what that data is and what that message is saying, and so the
Right.
timeliness of it is big. And of course, we can expand that to the kind of large scale when we talk about global conflicts
Hmm.
and COVID and all these other things that were changing rules and tariffs and everything else. It seems like on an hourly basis, and companies are making gigantic, huge decisions
Right.
on what to do with this data and how to pivot their business or to move their business in the right direction. So yeah, I think it's knowing what data you have.
Hmm.
It's knowing how good that data is, and
Right.
good is in quotes because it's all debatable on that. I'm still of the belief that even bad data can be good data in some
Right.
cases, depending on what you're doing with it. And then it's the speed of that data, and kind of tied to that is the location,
Mm.
because we're now in this world of cloud,
Yeah.
and we support cloud, and we're highly driven on cloud at Oracle. But you see that in lots of different places, and in fact my past employer at AWS is the very same thing.
Right.
And then you have multi-cloud, so everyone's going to have to play nice and work together. In fact, I think we just had an announcement with AWS in the last day or two, so we're friends and enemies at the same time. But you do have to think about where the data is and
Yeah.
what you're doing with that data, is it in the right place? Is it in
Mhm.
the right place to be timely for that action that you're going to do against that data too?
That's a really important point, right? Because when we think about data quality, a lot of times it's a very narrowly constrained view of, is the number correct? Right. Or even sometimes worse is, did I get the answer that I wanted? Right. And to your point, not necessarily because the data was bad, but it's really an argument about the answer, not the data itself. And you raise an interesting dimension of both, timeliness and speed of data as being critical elements for organizations to think about. And one of the issues I think that a lot of leaders and a lot of organizations will grapple with as they go into AI is think about, how do they help the system, the machine, decide, well, not only what data do I need to make a decision, but when do I use that data? Right.
Mm.
And that's an interesting dimension that I don't think a lot of people appreciate around from a data quality perspective. Right. Do I need the data from yesterday or today? How quickly do I need that data? How quickly do I need to pass that data on? Do you see that, especially to your point about the speed with which we're wanting to make decisions? Is that a gap that a lot of organizations are having to lean into?
I think with some data, there is a point around the evolving of the accuracy of data, right? Maybe not that we're talking bits and bytes and letters and things like numbers specifically, but sometimes you'll get information day one that by the time you get it day three, it is evolved because you've
Right.
added information into it. The accuracy is improved over that period. So not that the thing at the very beginning was wrong, but maybe it was partial,
Yeah.
missing different information. It didn't have the whole picture, and you get to the end. I think the other thing to think about too, and I kind of laugh about this because I spent a lot of time, probably back in the 2015, 2017, 2018 time, working on opportunities and different technologies around autonomous driving and autonomous trucks, and specifically.
Okay.
And the one thing that I notice more and more is that we talk all about the data and the inaccuracies of things about AI. We don't talk about the inaccuracy of humans,
Mm,
right? So
right.
it's not so much is, I mean, yes, it'd be great in a Nirvana world that everything was perfect and the
Right.
system was always perfect. Perfect data in, perfect answer out. We don't have that today.
No.
We don't have perfect data in. We have humans. I'm fallible in the middle. I'm an individual.
Right.
I'm sure other humans are too. And so I think it's less about measuring AI and other technologies like this against the perfection
Yeah.
and expecting perfection,
Right.
but measuring against how is it doing compared to what a human is doing? Is it
That's
doing it
right.
faster at the same inaccuracy level?
Hmm.
Is it doing it faster at a slightly less inaccurate level? Or in the case that's bad, is it doing it slower or even the same speed and less
Right.
accuracy, right? So I think
Right.
I think sometimes the bar of which we're measured is
Yeah.
not really the right bar. And we have to take that into account. I know we worked on a project when I was at AWS with a customer where we were talking about autonomous planning,
Mm.
and our goal is, we call it hands off the wheel. And that's what the customer's term was, in fact. And they said, hey, today we run our demand plan in this case, and then they would spend days adjusting what the system just told them. And
Right.
they said, we want a system that will give us the same answer after the humans put it in there and did all of their
Hmm.
massaging and working around. But in reality, that was actually incorrect, because when we did the project, the system always came up with a better answer. And
Right.
in the initial parts of the project, the user would go in and change something. So we
Right.
actually tracked what the system answer was versus what the humans did after the system
Hmm.
answer, and tracked that for about, I think it was about 30 days. Consistently, the humans always broke the answer.
Yes.
And so at the end, the customer said, no more humans. Like, the system is making the right decision. Let's not bring in the inaccuracies again of the humans. So I think it's
Right.
just a unique way to think about it. Perfection can always be the goal,
Yeah.
but it doesn't have to be the bar at which you measure
Right.
to go forward.
Right.
There needs to be a competency bar, a kind
Mm.
of threshold of which you have to be above, but it just doesn't have to be perfection.
No, absolutely. I think that's an extraordinarily critical point for people to really appreciate, that benchmark against which you're measuring. Yeah, is to your point, we expect the machine to be perfect, but it's not replacing perfect, right? And I think, as leaders, that's an important part of the journey that we have to lean into, right? If I use lean as a continuous improvement, to your point earlier about, quote, bad data is not in and of itself a failure. It's about, how then do I adapt and adjust. And you touch on a really interesting dimension about data quality, is going back to that, what's the answer I'm getting, right? And is that the answer I want? And so oftentimes we think garbage in, garbage out. So we focus on the garbage out. Well, you said, 500 units of inventory. So surely the garbage in was bad because it's only supposed to be 250. Or how do we embrace the conversation? But well, why 500 versus 250? Maybe it should be 250. That's what the machine gave us. Maybe it should be that. So yeah, some of the assumptions you were making as humans were wrong. Conversely, it may be that it is 500. Now, why is the machine thinking 250? So now we have to now walk back through not just the inputs, but the data processing elements that got us to the answer we want out. And I think that's where being really anchored on semantics of, well, what is it I'm trying to get out of this,
Yeah.
right? And anchoring on that from a data quality perspective is I think really important as we go down this journey.
It's a hard just concept for humans, I think, in general. And I'm assuming I'm not the only one, right? Which is that prioritization. And
Mm,
I see this in a non-data way, I guess somewhat tied to data on a daily basis, working with our customers. And we as a company have done thousands of these cloud deployments, whether it's in the finance or supply chain or human capital or different areas that we cover. And as we go through the issues that pop up, we call these things SRs or service requests. So it's just the ticketing system and the way that we manage these different issues and understanding them. And at the beginning of the process project, and as you go, the number just grows and grows and grows and gets huge. And everyone thinks 100% of all of these have to be solved to perfection for us to be successful, drive value, and go live, which is
right.
absolutely never ever the truth.
Yeah.
You go with that, and I think it's a good kind of tenet to start with because it gives everyone a target and really
Right.
a shared goal of working through these problems. But then at some point, you start to rationalize. The day gets closer, and the date gets closer, and you say, okay, well, okay, actually, we had 1,000 on the list. There's really only 500 we really
Right.
need. And then when you're a week out, you're like, okay, there's 10. Like if we don't get these 10, then we're really not going to go forward. And I think it's the same thing with data that you have to really rationalize and
Yeah.
prioritize. Some things, like you said, we need that, bit for bit, byte for byte accuracy
Yeah.
to understand exactly what this number is. Because like when I was at Amazon, if we're one off, I tell
Mm,
someone I've got it available to sell and I don't, that's a big impact. Like
yeah.
I've just disappointed a customer and other things. There's other things where being one off, okay, it's wrong. We need to fix it. We need to look at how cleaning that and make it better. But for
Right.
the ultimate decision, that semantic that we're looking for, it may not be a drastic impact. And that,
Right.
that can become hard. But that's what we as leaders are really empowered in most cases and at least responsible for
Yeah.
is making those decisions and guiding the teams and saying, hey, focus on this, don't focus on that. Because they can really get bogged down. I mean, they're in the middle of it, right? They're
Mm,
in the zeros and the ones and the ABCs, and they're just really caught up in that. And sometimes we as leaders can kind of stand back and say, hey, you're doing a great job. Thank you for focusing with this much attention and this much diligence, but you can raise it up a level, right?
right.
And really give them that guidance on where to go.
Right. No, and in many ways that's actually comforting because I think oftentimes when we've, come into these sorts of projects, to your point, we want to boil the ocean, right? We have to solve for
Yes.
everything before you even start. I remember, the conversation around the data lake. Well, the data lake has to be completely, full stocked with all the fish, right? With all the piers built out before I'm going to go in there and try to fish at all, right? Is everything in there? No. Well, then keep working at it before I even start working on it, right? And I think that's an important, sort of mental model that there is that progressive, sort of continuous improvement that you can work through this. You don't have to start, with start at 100. You progressively work your way up to that. And I think a lot of leaders, need to be able to lean into that mindset. But that opens up another element. I think that's an important part of the conversation around data and data quality in general, right? Is helping the organization think through, well, then what is that prioritization? What really is important? And I think for me that goes to, I oftentimes see a tension between, sort of the IT and the data team and the business. Right. And I know where I land on this on the question of who should own the data. Right. Should it be the business? Should it be IT? And how do they work together? I mean, what have you seen in that space in terms of A, do you see that tension? And then B, how do you see that tension get resolved?
That's a really great identification that you've got there, because and I think this applies well beyond data, at least to what
Mm,
I see in my day to day. Is there's very few conversations that I have where both of those groups should not be in the same conversation. Like there's very few where it's just an IT conversation. I mean, sure, if
right.
I'm talking about dropped packets or something specific at the DNS layer, okay, the business doesn't care. They don't understand. They're not. They're
We,
like,
we
just
don't
go
even
fix
we
it
don't
and
even
make
know
sure
what that
everything's
means.
connected. Yeah, but the same thing goes like if I'm talking about something very specific on sell rate or inventory turns,
Right.
the IT may have never heard that term in the first place, and they're not. But there's so many conversations, and I think companies miss this a lot. I think they're getting better and better. We make it a requirement on every project that we work on that there's always the representation on these key discussions and these key topics,
Right.
especially around things like data and AI for that matter, and these kind of technology enablements that everyone is in the same conversation. And even when you get into AI, you bring in things like security teams, bring
Hmm.
in legal teams, right? There's even some other layers. And it's one conversation. And yeah, there's minutes and bits and pieces where people are timed out or checked out for a second, in that conversation. But you've got to be everyone has to be hearing the same message. Everyone has to be hearing the same conversation. They need to insert, and sometimes to your point, agree, because there can be joint ownership
Yeah.
from the data, and that could be joint in that the business owns the data creation, the
Right.
business owns the data output, and the value driven from that. But
Hmm.
IT is that middle link that keeps the data in a centralized location, keeps it from getting polluted or keeps it from getting to issues or causing problems, and
Right.
also empowers the business to be able to use that data, because just putting it in a spreadsheet or a database is as amazing as those tools are that we've proven years over years. Getting them to these systems that can do autonomous
Right.
actions and decisions, to these systems such as AI, whether that's generative or agentic or anything else, that's where the business needs to make sure that they're on the front and the back of that, and the IT is the enabler in the middle.
Hmm.
I'm sure they have their own great ideas, and just
Right.
like every conversation I've had with these two groups, that they cross, good ideas back and forth. But I think the ownership is really important, and it's probably back to our old school rice, like
Hmm.
who's responsible, and
Right.
who's entering information, and who's just there to know what's going on, right?
Right.
And all of those kind of good statuses and different ownership perspectives that we have, I think, are still very important.
Right. You mean even in an AI world, I got to go pull out the old RACI charts, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think I mean, and now we've got a third party, right? We've got the machine.
Right.
It to
Yeah.
some extent becomes part of those racy charts, and so they, most of the time it's more not necessarily well, they can be responsible for storage, they can be responsible for processing, but then they're also informed in some cases because,
Right.
as you've probably talked in some of your other sessions, when you get into things such as generative and just building models and et cetera, we need that information. They may not make a direct decision in that little problem that you're doing, but they need that information gathered from many, many, many different points of the
Right.
business to then make a combined, whether it's an LLM or some other kind of model that they then support and that they use when they're making a
Right.
specific definition or a specific decision laser.
Right. Yeah, and you're getting into a point that I think is really critical, right? Is that a lot of times we think of data as sort of siloed or standalone, right? So if I go back to the example of on time in full, well, it's just calculating the numerator and denominator and and adding those two points together. But a lot of actually our decisions are really around how are we integrating data? How are we enriching that data? How are we, combining data sets, right? And so to that point about ownership, I think it's really important that really does have to be joined because, you know, how I make a decision or how I make a choice about an inventory level, or how I'm allocating stock to a customer, or what carrier do I want to use to deliver a load. There's a lot of decision making that the business actually enriches just simply, well, what three carriers are on this lane, how much do they charge, and what is the what equipment do they have. There's actually a lot more data that needs to enrich the choice that we're making. So when we're then thinking about how that needs to translate into the tech stack, into, well, what APIs do I have? How often do I go pull from the procurement system to understand, right, what's the quality performance of that carrier, to decide whether or not I tender to carrier A or carrier B in my vehicle scheduling process. Right now, that sounds really granular, but that's a lot of data architecting that actually has to happen for that data to be meaningful, right? For that
Yeah.
decision to be effective. And that's where, to your point, that really has to be a joined up conversation because oftentimes what I run into, I go back to the API example, right? So, even though I'm a business guy, I can spell API, right? Is because, what we fail is when Mike's making that choice about, the data to use to tender to a carrier, he can do that. He can choose the cadence of the data that's flowing. If that's not reflected in my data stack when my IT team is building, so are you pulling that API every half hour or every 2 hours? Then guess what? When I try to have the agent do that, it falls over. Right.
Mm.
So I think that really holistic and end-to-end thinking about how data sits within my decision making and how it's enriched is a really critical part of your data quality journey as well.
Yeah, and I don't think there's a perfect answer. Now, I
Right.
think I'm supportive very much so of what we're doing at Oracle, which I think is we've chosen a pathway in that kind of structure and how we do it. And I think it's the best way. Again, nothing's ever perfect, so I'm not saying we're perfect, but we've taken the more platform position, which says we don't have separate databases and separate silos where we keep this information. We have a singular
Mm,
database in what we call the Fusion applications, which covers the majority of what we offer,
right.
especially in the supply chain space, but even beyond in human capital and CX and ERP. It's a central location. All of these different groups and bits can have access to it. So, there's information that you might consider kind of human capital,
Right.
but even if I'm not implementing a human capital feature or function, I might need that someplace else, whether that's in my sales compensation or some other, area that I'm working in. We don't necessarily have to go implement human capital. It's in the database, it's stored there, it's centralized. And then that gives us, we think, a head start. And now that we've got all this foundational data, which you have to run your business anyway, whether
Right.
it's financial, statements or anything else, or supply chain, like you were just talking about, and understanding how to compare different suppliers in that case, or either indirect or direct procurement. Once you've got it all in that position, that just makes your AI journey that much easier.
Mm,
That doesn't mean you can't do it another way. Doesn't
right.
mean this way is perfect. But if you've got it centralized and you've got it in one place, that's why we're making those leaps and bounds. We started with we started in generative, then we went to agentic. Now we've got agentic applications already. We just
Right.
announced about a few weeks ago. And having all that data in one place makes our job easier and therefore the value faster and better
Right.
for the customers. There's still going to be other systems. There's still going to be data in other places that you can't control. You can't get it all in one save, and Oracle doesn't run the world. I get that. So not everything's going to be in our database. So we
Right.
do have that flexibility in our systems where even in our agentic side, you can reach out to other things, whether the APIs or direct database calls or going to another
Right.
model of some sort. We have that interconnectivity. But having that foundation of data and having that as centralized and as rationalized as possible and coming straight off of your transactions.
Right.
In our case, we think that that's the best way to go forward. And just like everything else in this space, that's the best decision today. It's going to change tomorrow. I mean,
Right.
things are so quickly shifting. One of our leaders said in our Oracle AI World last year in Las Vegas, they said, it's kind of like when we thought about, the internet, right? Back when we said the internet came out, we all knew it was big. We all knew it was going to be
Right.
something special, even with the dot bomb and everything else. But what it turned out to be is so much different
Mm,
than what we originally thought it would be, and actually so much more.
yeah.
We think AI is the exact same thing.
Right.
Yes, what we're doing now is going to be valuable, probably even a little bit more directly than what we thought about in the general internet as a whole. But what it looks like in 10 years is going to be completely different from a completely different perspective. And it's probably going to wow us even more.
Yeah.
So just being ready for those changes and having that foundation of data and hopefully as clean as possible,
Right.
hopefully as centralized as possible, just gives you the power to make those decisions.
No, absolutely. And you touched on something interesting in there, right? I mean, the technology behind data is itself evolving, right? So, what the database structures look like today, they might not even be called databases today anymore, right? But what those structures look like today are very different from what they might have been even just 5 years ago, right? So, what are some of those sort of misconceptions that you are seeing, leaders, organizations are having to confront when they think about how they're building their data stack that might have been true a couple of years ago that's not true today? Is it what, when you talk about data cleansing, you know what, AI can actually help you there, right? You don't have to cleanse the way you cleansed by throwing
Yeah.
X number of bodies at something, 5 years ago to get it cleansed. You can programmatically attack it. You still have to go through the process, but we now have new toolkits there, right? Your point about how do you structure and think about your data organizations. What are some of those sort of, other misconceptions that you're seeing people needing to sort of move past in order to accelerate their data journey?
I think you're right. It very much has evolved. I mean, unfortunately, I've been doing this long enough to remember when master data management was the biggest topic.
Right.
And the whole idea, I remember the sayings were always, well, is it DR? Is it DR period? Is it drive? Like, because
Right.
the systems then weren't smart enough to know the difference. They
Yeah.
would see those as three separate different entries,
Yeah.
regardless of how you spelled the actual street name or the numbers associated with it.
Hmm.
And they couldn't figure it out, right? They would think it's three different addresses, three different customers or locations or whatever it might be.
Right.
And to your point, now AI has more of that cognition
Yeah.
to say, well, okay, DR period, and drive, they're all the same thing. I can interpret them the same, and therefore I can use them in the same way. We have to teach it that, right? It's not
Right.
just like intelligent on its own. So there's only, at least today, there's only so far you can take it to a trust point, as we talked about
Right.
before you have to, trust and then verify, right? So you
Mm.
might trust it and let it make some of its decision. Then you go back and either human in loop or something else where you verify and say, okay,
Right.
yes, it's understanding AVE, AV, and avenue is all the same three things, and that's correct. Or maybe there was something, in some different language where AVEN made something different. No, it
Right.
doesn't mean avenue is something, right? And giving that feedback. So I think that still happens. I think people get a little bit too caught up, and I haven't seen master data management as kind of the topic is highly focused on as it has been in the past. So I
Right.
think that's probably a positive thing. Not positive in that we shouldn't do it, but positive in that we've evolved and that there's
Right.
different ways of doing it today. I think from a data perspective, I do think that you have to be focused on the end result of what you're doing with the data. So the
Hmm.
outcome, back what you said, like about the semantics about it and what you're really trying to get done with the data, and deciding how clean is good for you. And how do you get there?
Right.
Is that cleaning data you already have? Is that doing better acquisition of data? And I think that's getting better too, right? Because more and more things that we do, especially in the supply chain space, we're acquiring data natively
Mm.
digitally, right? Whether you're talking about PLCs on a manufacturing line, when I was at AWS, we worked with customers where we had PLCs that were on motors,
Hmm.
and they would monitor the temperature and the vibration and everything else you can think of. And then we had machine learning models behind that said, well, if vibration gets to a certain level,
Right.
temperature gets to a certain level, in 6 days, this thing's going to explode.
Yeah.
Right. And so like, that acquisition of data is getting better, which helps us because then we
Yeah.
don't have to worry
Yeah.
as much about the accuracy of the data, or at least the source of the data. We still have to kind of watch and look at the accuracy. But I think the source is getting better. Where it gets difficult is partners, right?
Mm.
And as you mentioned this earlier, and I remember back in running the supply chain and logistics side for Niagara Bottling, is we had a way of measuring on time and full internally. And we had lots of big customers. I mean, Costco is one of our largest customers. Walmart is one of our largest customers. We actually had a more specific way of measuring on time and full than either of those much larger than we were,
Right.
customers had. And sometimes we would show up and say, hey, your demand plan is off because you're measuring this incorrectly. And they would scratch their heads. And to some extent, I think that is also another topic that we haven't quite touched on, which is the volume of data,
Yeah.
right? And the amount of data that's there, and somehow you can get clouded and overwhelmed by this data. But I think it goes back to what we just talked about, which is the prioritization of which data is important. How perfect does it need to be based on that data?
Yeah.
And then that helps you kind of, eat the elephant one bite at a time, as they say,
Right.
so that you can really handle this volume of data and this massive data.
Yeah. No, you touched on a lot of really important elements in there. I think one of the things that I'd want to, just lean into a bit more, right, is that unfortunately, I think sometimes there is a complacency that people have with data. And even today in the conversation around, AI can help with master data management, it can help us with the cleansing. I think there, to your point, and I'm glad you said it, right? There's this view that, well, I just have to turn the machine on and it knows exactly what is supposed to be, right? But to your point, there is work that needs to happen to make sure that that's fit for purpose for you, your business, and then guess what, your partners, your suppliers, your customers, right? Or even just across geographies within which you're operating. And I think that kind of goes a bit to where I see failures in pilots, right? Because it works really nicely in the sandbox, But then when it gets out, and guess what, AAV is actually really important in Spain, right? But it's avenue
Yeah.
in the U.S. Then we just throw out the whole thing and say, well, it's broken. We're not going to fix it, right? I think that how you sustain that energy to work through, whether it's an edge case, whether it's what, when I get to Costco, they define it this way. So how do I build that in? So I don't have somebody now manually calculating for Costco versus, for Walmart versus for, Kroger. So how then do you progressively work through that and then recursively build that back into your calculations, into your data, into your system? So now that's picked up. And I think I see oftentimes that's where pilots, we say, you said it earlier, right? The pilots failed. Well, no, actually it hasn't. Right? We just now need to enrich the system so it's now actually fit for purpose.
Yeah, I think the correlation and the context is the harder part for AI, and it's also the more powerful part, right?
Mm,
But we have to help it in that sense to understand what is a real correlation, what's the right context. The language side, I think, is getting more and more simple, and it's got a lot of it takes a lot less input to make sure that that is correct. But I also think you really need to pilot at scale.
yeah.
It's we always talk about, hey, let's do a small pilot. I think
Yeah.
when you talk about AI, it can't necessarily, at least
Yeah.
from the data that you're sourcing and applying to, has to be at scale. It doesn't have to be one for one scale. It doesn't have to be the exact data that you're going to scale to, but it has to be at the a rough order of magnitude of the scale that
Right.
you're going to apply to, whether that's the source information or the type of decisions that you're making. And I think that context and correlation also has to be nuanced. I liked
Mm,
your expression too, where you talked about, different company. Like if I'm a supplier to these retailers, I need to give them the answer in the language that they understand.
right.
And LMs and AI can help with that,
Yeah.
right? They can help me, translate. I can do it in the my old world. I can do it in my organization's language. Then I can instruct these AI models on, okay, when I say A, that really means C here, and that means F over here,
Right.
right? And so that they can kind of almost like a translation of the answer to some extent, and that can be it's a different calculation.
Hmm.
That can be it's a different interpretation of the data and how the correlations and the context are understood. It's an actual pretty powerful part of the AI is there isn't always just one answer, and I think
Right.
that's also the people get confused with when they come out with what you might call bad results. First of all, like you said, I think the bad results can be bad for the goal that you were going for, but still helpful and
Right.
instructive on what you need to do to be able to still get to that goal. But I also think we need to realize that there can be more than one answer,
Hmm.
and that sometimes we need more than one answer.
Right.
And understanding, when I get the output, well, that might not be the one answer I was looking for, but hey, that's actually a good answer for something else.
Yeah.
And then go back and work with the models and work with the AI to make sure that you are, guiding it into, in some cases, forcing it to give you the answers specifically that you need to support, whatever specific the answers. But I think sometimes we get a bit too hung up on again, the human's always right and the human's always perfect, which we know isn't true.
Right.
So when the answer isn't exactly what we wanted, we discount it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think sometimes we need to not just discount it that it might have helped us someplace else, but not just look at it and say, okay, well, maybe that's an answer. It's not the answer I was looking for, but
Right.
is that a valuable answer? Can I still
Right.
do something with it? And the answer can still be no. There's those cases. I'm sure they exist. I know I've seen them. And they exist at every company where okay, that's still garbage, right? Like I
Right.
asked it a question and it gave me an answer as if I lived on Pluto, right? So it just doesn't
Right.
work right.
Right. And that's really fascinating because that is in many ways actually what we want the AI to do, right? It's not necessarily to just replicate my thought process. It's about how does it expand in ways that we can appreciate, right? I mean, that's the power of it, is being able to see relationships and connections that, we as human beings can't necessarily maintain. So if it's giving me an answer on, you should hold inventory of this much, and I say, well, that's wrong. Well, it may be it's
Right.
because it's actually looking 2, 3 tiers deep in ways that, I never looked at skew 1, 2, 3 and recognized that there is a dependent relationship. Right? I'm only looking at, 1, 2 layers, and I'm missing it. Right? And guess what? That's why we're always stalking out. Well, because Derek's only looking at 2 levels deep and the AI is looking 5 levels deep. But then that now opens up a whole nother set of questions around, to your point, around being able to pilot at scale. One, to help train the AI effectively, and then to be able to surface these kinds of relationships. But then it's also about, now, how do I trust it? Right? Because you said earlier around trust, you have to go through the progression of, hand holding, trust, and verify, and then now it can go off on its own, right? So how do you help organizations and leaders think through that maturation of, what, we're doing this with this macro goal of surfacing new opportunities, closing off risks that we were never able to handle, in a way that we can actually trust that the data and the processing of that data is actually fit for purpose.
Yeah, I think there's a continuum in my mind, right, of what when you have to trust and when you can, bend your trust a little bit. Depends on the use case. So if I'm talking financial reporting to the street, I've got to trust it and it's got to be right. Like there's no flexibility
Exactly.
because the government and the lawyers do not have a sense of humor when it comes to these things, right? So, there's you will need to ultimately trust it to do this for you. And we work with customers, and some of our largest customers are doing 5-day closes at the end of the quarters, and even faster than that. We do that ourselves at Oracle. So I think, but that those take more time, right? Because
Right.
those are trust verify, trust verify, trust verify, just over and over and over again. And you
Right.
do that to the nth degree with those specific use cases. I think there's others that are probably that middle bunch
Yeah.
where you know you're going to need some human in the loop to start. You're going to need some checking over time, but once you've seen a trend, that usually can show you a continued trend, and then it becomes almost like auditing, almost like spot checking, going in every so once in a while, making sure that it is, because they can still be business impacting, but maybe not the legal kind of
Right.
close my business kind of impacting that you might have in a financial statement. And then there's others, I think, to your point, where we've almost got to be open for a crazy answer.
Hmm.
There's fewer of those cases, and they're going to take more, flexibility and honestly more thought process on
Right.
the side of us humans to look at it, just like you said, and say, well, I came up with this idea when I was at AWS, and they built it into an initial solution, which was this N tier supply chain. N being the little n for variable,
Yeah.
and the idea was, how do we connect what I have in inventory, my producibility from a, say, like a retailer perspective, from my supplier, from their supplier. If you think about an automotive solution, there can be a part in it can have a car, and one of the things in that car can go down 5-6 levels
Hmm.
to silicon or even sand
Right.
that goes into the silica chip that builds all the way up and end up being a CarPlay module inside of a car.
Yeah.
Each one of those levels has different information. Each one's going to be trusted differently because it's a different partner.
Right.
And so we worked on a solution how you connect those in kind of a graph database type of format where everything's connected. But it would identify things that we as humans would never see. And I
Hmm.
used to call it the diamond of death, which was, I'm sourcing from 4 different companies as my suppliers,
Right.
when in reality, those 4 companies are sourcing a singular component that's critical to each
Right.
one of their same products from a single supplier.
Right.
So it's of death, because if that one supplier below those 4 goes out of business and I didn't have that visibility, there's no way for me to see. So again, to your point, that's one of those where we have to be open to just the incapability of us as humans to process the volume of data that these AI models can process. And then questioning them, because I don't think we need to stop doing that. I think
Right.
we can't just sit by and go, oh, this thing's smarter than me, it must be right.
Right.
No, it's sit back and go, okay, this thing is able to process more information than me. It's probably able to process it much faster, and maybe in some cases make connections I didn't even think about.
Yeah.
No different than you would do if you and I were sitting across the table and I gave you a crazy idea,
Hmm.
right? So I think we need to apply that same process, that same kind of collaboration and trust and mistrust and skepticism and all those kind of things back and forth with the system, and then in the end decide if we like it or not. And
Right.
luckily, at least today, it's not Terminator style yet. We still get to decide if we like it or not, and we can say, okay, nope, that just does. It sounds like a great idea. Maybe it's crazy, maybe it's genius, and 5 years later we'll look back and we'll think, oh, we should have chosen that. As today, we can still make that decision as humans and say, nope,
Right.
that's not good. Or, you know what? I never would have thought about this. Is exactly what AI is going to do for me, other than just automate everything that I've ever wanted to do. It's going to show me things I couldn't have done
Right.
at the speed or with the amount of input. And it's not necessarily that we're dumb as humans, but just as how it collates that information, how it sees it all at one time. We go off and we become the stewards of
Right.
the AI, right?
Right.
And the ones that are kind of pointing the AI left and right and guiding it and educating it. And then we'll see where we get.
Yeah.
We'll see if, John Connor and others show up in our future or not. So,
Which interesting opens a whole nother set of data, right? That we're going to have to manage, which is sort of the, what are the explanations behind the answers that the AI is giving, right? It's going to be capturing, well, walk me through that diamond of death, right? Okay. Now how do I then take that as another input and build that, almost recursively build that back into, okay, yeah, now those are the kinds of relationships I want to surface. So now that's another part of training data as well as your process data that you now have to build in. So that's now another data set
yeah.
to think through and manage accordingly.
Yeah, explainability. At least when I was at AWS, it was a huge topic. It was a huge topic at AWS because AWS is a bit more of a builder community than a buyer community. It's shifted over the years,
Yeah.
but it very much started as the builder community. And of course, builders want to know everything, right? They want to get down on the hood and see everything. And why has it worked like this? And explain it to me. And in fact, in that example I gave you with one customer around the planning, they wanted the explainability of, okay,
Right.
why did it give me this answer? At Oracle, we spend a lot of time doing that for our customers, right? So we go off and we do these large scale models and the proof of concepts and look at the explainability. We still provide some of that, but it becomes our job to check the models and
Mm.
check their accuracy and make sure it's doing that right so that our customers don't have to worry about the
Right.
explainability as much. They
Right.
still will, and we'll still provide them guidance there, especially when they get outside of our Fusion applications. But yeah, explainability is it's the trust and verify, right? Over and over again.
Right.
We as humans are, very questioning on, is this the right answer? Is it done in the right way? And I think that's another thing to remember too, is the right answer isn't always just the answer at the end. It's sometimes how you've gotten there.
Right.
And that can be in legal senses and financial senses too, right? Like, I remember when I was younger and teachers, doing math problems. Well, I got the right answer. What
Right.
difference does it make how I got there? Well, and
Right.
sometimes it does, right? So we
Yeah.
do have to keeping that in mind too.
That's right. So show me your work.
Yeah, I was the worst at that. I'll be the first to admit to any of my teachers that ever watch this, I was the worst.
Well, Brian, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and we could probably carry on with a whole season just really around data, the implications of data, and how you work around this. I think quite a number of things that you touched on in there around don't make perfection your benchmark, right? I think that's a really important element. It's about this really is going to be messy. Right. It is about, being able to go through the journey and you might have some fits and starts, but this really is about how you work through, build the integration, build the relationships, and make this fit for purpose for your organization. And that data is not something you can't ignore it. You really have to embrace it and work through it. But there are tools that can help you work through that, and it's not something that you can avoid. So this has really been an extraordinary conversation. I really appreciate your expertise and the experience that you've brought to the table. So thank you. Looking forward to many more such conversations with you.
Yeah, no, this has been great. I appreciate you having me with you and at this time we spent together. I think the last thing I would say is my advice to people is experiment. Experiment small. Small value adds up to big value. We call it the quarters and the dimes. You add up enough quarters and dimes and they turn in millions of dollars. So you don't always have to go after the big one. So experiment small, make a few big bets along the way. And hopefully some of those pay off too. But I think it's just, don't miss the train, right?
Yeah.
So be on there, get some value out of it and push it forward as fast and as much as you can.
Absolutely. Excellent. Brian, thank you. Thanks for listening to Supply Change. If today's conversation sparked questions, and it should, that's the point. Supply chain is complex, and these questions don't resolve in a single conversation. Share this podcast with someone who's navigating these decisions, and join us for the next episode as we continue exploring what it really takes to make AI work.